Hey everyone, this is another episode of the Divergent Conversations podcast. I'm your co-host Patrick
And I'm Dr. Neff.
and Megan is going to kind of start us off today following up and continuing on the conversation we had last week about diagnosis history.
Yes. So I messaged you right after we stopped recording and I was like, hey, can we continue that conversation next week? I think my thought after we recorded was that was cool to talk about our diagnosis experience and like post-diagnosis, our response to it. But I left feeling like that's not actually my diagnosis story. Those are the details of kind of surrounding my diagnosis. But my diagnosis story starts back when I was like a 2 or 3-year-old eating dirt out of the plant and then becoming a OCD anxious child. And like my diagnosis story starts with my misdiagnosis story. So I thought it'd be really interesting to go back and talk about like Patrick and Megan Anna as undiagnosed children and teens. There's something you said last week about a lot of the questions that you had about yourself, you were kind of answering under this umbrella of complex trauma. I was also trying to answer questions and like putting on lenses like, is there repressed trauma here? So I think that would be a really interesting area for us to continue to explore.
Yeah, when you brought that up to me, I started thinking about it and it started to make a lot of sense to have that conversation. And I think, you just brought up something that clicked for me. Like, we are so often seeking these answers, right? Like,
Hmm.
why? The why behind something. Why do I present this way? Why do I act this way? Why do I experience life this way? And I think we're always constantly, not just existentially, but like there's this there's this need to know. And
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that's really important to just be mindful of like how badly people who feel like they don't belong or fit in are trying to figure out the why behind that
Mhm.
and how challenging and painful that can be as an experience throughout the duration of a lifespan.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, right before I was diagnosed, I'd been in depth therapy with a analytic psychotherapist for 3 years. And we were at the point of the work of like, I was coming to accept I would just never have answers to all of these questions. Like that was my work. And then I got answers, which was lovely. Um, but yeah, there's so much searching. I've so many, particularly women and genderqueer people, have reached out with a similar story of. I was looking into like the possibility of repressed trauma to explain this, but just people spending thousands and thousands of dollars and time in psychotherapy trying to get those answers.
And so much frustration along the way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Each misdiagnosis leading to more irritation and frustration and just kind of wanting to wave the white flag of
Hmm.
like, all right, I've tried everything I can.
Yeah.
None of this is accurate. I fucking give up.
Well, it's almost, I think we could even think of it as a reenactment when every time there's a misdiagnosis, like our experience of misattunement to the world, our experience of being misattuned to ourselves, every time we're misdiagnosed, we're re-experiencing a misattunement. And so I think, and then, so a classic story, right? Especially people who are more fight flight oriented, they get misdiagnosed, their fight flight instincts come out, they get angry at the provider comes back like, "Oh, I think this is BPD." Like, and then we're definitely off and running with an enactment.
Yeah. And then leading to a lifetime of stigmatization and
Mhm.
discrimination and therapists who don't want to work with you and
Yep.
kind of pushed to the side of saying, oh, this person is going to do A, B, and C when they come to therapy, or
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
going to be difficult to work with.
Yeah. It'd be really interesting to do a study of like self-alienation among late in life diagnosed. And it's funny, late in life diagnosed can mean so many things. I think of like 30 plus when I mean, 20s is definitely a later time to be diagnosed. My child who's diagnosed at 11, that's late for a child. So, but like 30 plus, it'd be really interesting to look at like self alienation.
Yeah.
Because I bet there'd be a lot of it.
Yeah, I'm sure that there would. So take us back to Meg and Anna's childhood. Like, what are we
Yeah.
noticing? What's coming up when you're thinking
Uh-huh.
about going back in time and just some of the things that were showing up or you were
Mhm.
experiencing that you can remember?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have pretty good memory, like a lot of autistic people. So the eating dirts and plants, I definitely and I like remember eating paper. It's so weird because I saying these things now, it's like, oh, that's obvious. It never seemed weird to me. It was like, of course you would see what paper tasted like in dirt, and of course dirt is delicious out of plants.
Yeah.
Um, but that was
How
one
could
of
you
those
know any
things.
differently though? Like, that's just your reality at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah. So pica, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but pica is really common among autistic children. Um, And so that was present. I wasn't necessarily the child that had, like, huge tantrums. In early childhood, I did start having, like, some depression, anxiety, and OCD, and I remember, like, I would retreat to my closet a lot, and I would kind of hide in there. I'd make up songs, like, really sad songs, and, um, there's definitely some depression early in life. I had a lot of rituals, which it's hard to know if that like and this is really hard to tease out with OCD and autism, but I had a lot of rituals like um every time I would leave my parents, I'd say goodbye, love you, don't die. And if I missed it, I'd be so anxious all day that they were going to die because I hadn't like I mean that seems more OCD because it's I'm trying to protect something from it. Um but my parents, they did I have talked to them a lot. It's so my dad's a psychologist, so that's interesting, right? I have talked to them a bit about what they saw, and they definitely noticed the OCD stuff. I had a lot of, like, how I would move my face. I need if I move my nose this way, I'd have to make it even, so I'd be, like, doing a lot of things like that, or I had to make things I touched even. So there's a lot of, like, OCD rituals I was doing early in childhood. And they had a conversation apparently about, do we seek out help and diagnosis? They obviously weren't thinking autism. I'm a child of the '80s, like, um, more OCD stuff. And ultimately they decided like, let's not stigmatize this by getting treatment. Which again, in the '80s, that made a little bit more sense than that would now. And kind of see what happens. And it kind of passed, which can be common for children. It got internalized in my adolescence, which we can maybe talk about later. Um, and I was a sensory seeker. So I have two older sisters. They were always very close. I was always the outsider. It was like my sibling relationship was my first social isolation. Um, and I think I would purposely, like the sensory seeker in me would purposely bug them. So I had difficulty in those relationships and difficulty in friendships. It was more though because I had this like idealized best friend and then I'd be disappointed. At least that was the narrative I was telling myself. Um, so yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a clustering of early childhood. Oh, and I had difficulty reading. Looking back, I had surface level dyslexia. I think I still probably do, which is why I still have grammar errors that go out to hundreds of thousands of people on Instagram sometimes. So reading in school were so painful for me. I hated going to school. I didn't have words for it, but looking back, it's like I was so bored. I was so sensory overloaded. I was so confused. Like I wasn't tracking um, the teacher. So I also had this as a child. I had a pretty strong sense that I was stupid, and I saw my sisters being very smart. So yeah, I don't know. That was my early childhood. What was your early childhood like? Was it as bright and beautiful as mine?
It was super fucking dark. Like, I have such little memory of childhood because my parents got divorced when I was 5, and it was a really
Hmm.
volatile, traumatizing divorce, and we moved a lot. So, like, there was just a lot of, disorientation and dissociation and just the
Mhm.
inability to really find any sort of grounding or regulation. Um, and I do remember, like, some of the stuff that you're mentioning, like, as a kid eating stuff because, like, mint flavored chapstick and, like,
Oh
those
yeah, I ate
just,
chapstick
like
too.
those and, like,
Yeah, why do
Uh,
they do that? It's like they're
I
trying
don't
to
know.
get
Like, what are you supposed to do with it? So I just eat like sticks of it and get sick. Um,
oh my
I
gosh.
would eat like, not Play-Doh, but like I would definitely like bite and chew and smell everything, especially like
Yep.
silly putty
Mhm.
Play-Doh-ish stuff. Um, I do remember that really vividly. I had collections of things. Like I
Yes,
had
me too.
endless amounts of Beanie Babies. One, I thought I was gonna get
Mhm.
like super rich, but also I had like tons of them. I had this Garfield collection where it was just like everything Garfield, ceramics,
Oh, that's
stuffed
amazing.
animals, everything. Like I had this massive paper mache Garfield bank that I bought at a yard sale and like all of this stuff. And then like weird obsessions that come to mind now, like pugs, the animal, like pug bags and stuffed animals and
Uh-huh.
figurines. Was really obsessed with Arnold Schwarzenegger, so I had like tons of Arnold Schwarzenegger stuff.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh. Do you remember who Jonathan Taylor Thomas was?
I did.
I was obsessed with him. I would have celebrity crushes. I put posters of him all over my room. Like I had a bunk bed. I put posters on the ceiling so I'd like it'd be the last thing I would see before I'd go to bed at night. Um, yeah, I would special interest hard on cute celebrity boys.
Yeah. I had a lot of those special interests. I think that's the one thing that stands out to me. And I think the other thing is like two things you named. School was so boring for me. I would
Mhm.
get in trouble a lot. I couldn't sit still. I would blurt
Mhm.
things out in class. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about probably fits more of the ADHD type for me at the time, but I would get straight A's. I wouldn't have to try. I'd retain
Mhm.
information really easily. I was in advanced reading. I do remember being in speech therapy though when I was younger. I couldn't really um
Yeah, that's really common. Yep.
yeah, but I don't remember much of it. I just remember like having to leave class and do it. One thing that's always stood out is the challenge with connecting and making friends. I don't think I made my first like actual friend until 3rd grade. That always stood out to me
Mhm.
where it was just very challenging. I have 4 sisters as well, so I was
Mhm.
always kind of like on this island and just reading a
Mhm.
lot by myself a lot. And
Mhm.
I think also like as we get into like adolescence, I got in trouble all the fucking time. Like
Mhm.
stuff to I did some like really bad stuff as a teenager but I was seeking it out. But I think a lot of
Uh-huh.
that too was like I didn't have parents who were paying attention to me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
even if all the signs were there that, you know, your son is autistic, they were
Mhm.
never going to get me tested or support because the divorce was messy and they were just kind of like
Mhm.
unable to almost take care of themselves as adults. So it was a lot of self-soothing, and that became something that has still been one of my coping mechanisms to this
Mhm.
day is self-soothe of like not asking for help, having to do everything on your own. And that could be obviously that brings its own challenges with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you use when you talk about kind of self-soothing on your own, like, would you say you have a more avoidant attachment style?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Same.
Um, yeah. It was like that's why I think I always liked fantasy so much. Like I could
Yeah.
escape into it. Um, Definitely was like avid Goosebumps reader, Boxcar Kids.
Oh, I love Boxcar Kids. It was like my fantasy to be one. Like the first book, particularly when they're setting up the boxcar and they're like getting the dishes. I don't know what that first book, I probably reread it so many times.
There's something like
Love
romanticized about
children.
that, right? Of like
Yes.
run away and like live in this like
Yeah.
secret place and like have this family here, this unit to support you with. And Lord of the Rings, Hobbit stuff, like that was obsessive. Like that was
Mhm.
special interest to the max and like rereading and rereading. And often like going off into those worlds because it was the only place that I could feel playful. It was the only place I could
Yeah.
feel safe. And I was like, this is this, and it's still a big part of my life
Yeah.
today.
You know, I see a lot of that in like assessments I do. People folks I work with, like when books are special interests, it's harder to detect because that's a positive thing, right? Like, oh, good, like Patrick's off reading. Like no one's like, "Oh, Patrick's off reading for hours. We should go get him an autism assessment." Like no one's
Yeah.
thinking that way when books are the special interest.
Right. Absolutely. That's a great point. But then if you're like behind the scenes, you're like, but Patrick read the Lord of the Rings trilogy 10 times this week. Like,
Yep.
continues to reread it and reread it and reread it. And if
Yeah.
you offer him something new, then he's going to get really irritable and there could be some sort of meltdown that happens.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. That's why you always like this is something that when I consult with therapists learning about assessment, it's like, don't you can't just stay at the surface of like, what do you do for fun? I read. It's like, what do
Right.
you read? How many times do you read it? What do you watch? How many times have you watched that series? Like, you've got to do that second layer of questioning around these really common responses. Like, I read, I watch TV. It's like,
Well, there's
how
such
do you
things,
those
concrete
things?
black and white responses, right? Of like very everything's linear, everything's really fact based and everything's really concrete. So
Yep.
without going beneath the surface, without asking those questions to that aren't just yes or no questions, right? Like you mentioned last week about your husband telling your daughter there was meat in the food when there clearly wasn't, and just the
Mhm. Mhm.
reaction. And that's the same thing. Like, what do you do for fun? Oh, I play soccer. Oh, I
Right.
write. Oh, I watch this show. But if you're like, what do you watch? How many times do you watch it? What characters do you really like? What characters do you not like? Then you
Mhm.
kind of start developing that worldview of like, oh, here are the special interests that are really coming into play.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 I love hearing about people with collections and childhood special interests.
So you mentioned like, you were like, oh, I kind of had that too. Like Beanie
Yeah.
Babies were a thing for sure.
I had some Beanie Babies. I think my collections, well, when I was a young child, I had a coin collection, which is kind of boring.
I
But
had a coin collection
basketball
too.
cards. Really? Um, basketball cards was my thing. And I like went to this like small card shop in Oregon and got a really good deal on like 4,000 basketball cards. And I spent so much time organizing them and then reorganizing them. At first, I'd organize them by team and then by rookie, but I couldn't do like rookie and team, which was so frustrating for me. Like I couldn't figure out my perfect way to catalog all these cards. But the Portland Trail Blazers were like huge special interests. Um, Robinson was another like special interest person who was a basketball player for the Blazers back in the 90s. And I got three of his autographs on cards throughout my childhood. So Blazers basketball cards was huge collection. The other one was Barbies. It's really interesting. I remember I'd buy a Barbie and instead of like playing with it, I like the whole idea of like having characters talk to each other. I can't do that. Even as a mom, I can never play with my kids that way. But what I would do is I'd pull out the marketing pamphlet you get with it, and I would just fantasize about like building my Barbie collection and like, okay, I'll buy this next, and then like it'll be a whole set. And it was about building the collection. It wasn't about playing with them.
Yeah, that's interesting because I had like these action figures that I would do that with. Like wouldn't play with them, but it was nice to collect them and create the worlds that they lived in. And
Mhm.
definitely had a coin collection. Had a lot of like minerals and rocks and gems and all
My
sorts of stuff.
kids both have had rock collections. Yeah, that's a common one.
Yeah, I feel like I still have one today because I just like finding cool rocks when I'm traveling. But like, yeah, all of that stuff is coming back to me now. Where it was just like,
Huh?
yeah, I was a weird fucking kid off on my own, just doing these things that
Mhm.
nobody knew, you know. And
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think that was soothing and also unbelievably isolating.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that experience of isolating and then finding comfort in fantasy, I think that's a really common. I know I resonate with that. I spent a lot of time in fantasy, um, which I think can be hard on relationships when our way to self-soothe is to isolate and then escape into a fantasy world where everything's great.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is very true. And I still do that to this day with more intuition and more introspection now and awareness. But I do escape into fantasy when I'm feeling like when we talked about autism burnout, when I'm burnt out or just
Yeah.
really low. And that is just a way to kind of escape or just soothe or find that comfort and in that connection that you're kind of missing out on a lot of the time. You
Yeah.
can kind of connect with the characters and feel like you can envision being a part of that world.
Hmm. Hmm. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit to college, but I think one pattern that was pretty unhelpful for me, um, this was so helpful when I learned that people could be special interests because that happened to me so much throughout my life. But especially like dating, college, high school years. Um, but like when a person's a special interest and then you're prone to fantasy, like and the fantasy of the person and you're like fantasizing what you would do with that person is always better than the reality of actually being with another body in a room when you're autistic, in my opinion.
For
Um,
sure.
because it's hard to be in a body, let alone like around another body who chews and like right. Um, and so that dynamic always was hard on dating relationships. For me, it was so helpful in my psychoanalytic training when I started changing my relationship to my imagination and fantasy. I used to feel, I think, maybe some guilt around it. That's probably come from like old fundamentalism. But now I just have curiosity. Like, so in fantasy, I think your fantasy world sounds a little bit different than mine. It sounds like you're going into a fantasy world someone else has created. I tend to have more fantasy around like my ideal self and idealized relationships or interactions. Once I was able to shift toward curiosity of like, what is this fantasy telling me about like my unmet needs or what I'm desiring in this moment versus comparing my real life to that fantasy, that was a huge shift for me that really has helped me have a healthier relationship to fantasy.
So I like hearing that perspective for sure. Yeah, I've always had a hard time creating my own like version of that. Like my therapist will ask me to drop into that. Like we do a lot of IFS work and parts work. And she's like, can you visualize this, and this? And I'm like, I cannot access this. Like I can't recreate it. I just have that like absolute immediate blockade. And it's interesting, but like, um, it's just always been one of those things where those special interests have kind of helped you get by along the way
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
because it brings such comfort and satisfaction and excitement and joy. And, what the fuck am I doing with 300 Garfield items? Like nothing. They're sitting on this shelf. And like they were so comforting at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
seeking
mean,
them out at garage sales.
it's such a powerful way that we self-soothe and self-regulate. That's when, again, when I'm working with people, consulting with therapists around how to be a more neurodivergent from a therapist, like sensory and special interests. Those are the two things that I start with of like your sensory safety and sensory regulation and incorporate special interests. That's how, if you're feeling like you're not able to access that person's inner world, get them talking about their special interests. You see emotion, you're going to see excitement, you're going to see passion, and it's how we self-soothe and self-regulate. Um, it's a really powerful thing we have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. So then when we're talking about like what does teenage years look like for you? Because that I have a little bit more ability to tap into. Like I have such a hard time remembering years like 3 through 10, 11. Like those they feel murky. They feel like they're behind this like mist or film or like they're not accessible a lot of the time.
Hmm. Teenage. Can we let's just skip it. Yeah, teenage years were rough, which for a lot of autistic girls, that's when things tend to get pretty rough because you really start noticing the social differences because like female social communication gets much more nuanced um, and more dependent on like emotional sharing. So my teenage years, I was like seriously struggling with depression, anxiety, self harm, and suicidality at that point. Like my mental health was a mess. And at that point, I did get into therapy, which was helpful. And yeah, I got the support I needed. Religion was my special interest at that time, which I have oh my gosh, religion and autism could be its own I was gonna say its own episode, it could be its own podcast. Um, there's a lot of ways looking back that I think my fundamentalist upbringing was very not good for me. In some ways, having that in those high school years when I was so depressed and suicidal provided it provided okay, I'm gonna use big analytic words. It provided a big other. It provided an anchor for me, and I needed something to orbit. And I think that's what special interests do is they give us something to orbit. So religion was that thing, but I was so like literal with it, concrete with it. It was I had a pretty unhealthy relationship to it. So I was this like very religious high schooler who was very depressed, very anxious. Well, actually, I was more depressed than anxious, I would say. I was depressed and religious. Um, the other thing that's really interesting to look back, starting my sophomore year of high school, one thing I started doing is, and I did this partly out of my like religious rhetoric, was I would look for the kids who were eating alone at lunch, like in the halls, and I'd go eat with them. So this might be like um, kids with disabilities who are in at that time, like the special ed classes, or just kind of the social outcasts who were eating alone. And I had like a rotating group of 4 or 5 that I'd go eat with. Um, and back then, I think I thought I was doing as this, like I was being a really good Jesus follower by, coming to the marginalized. Looking back, I think that was an adaptation. I think the cafeteria probably overwhelmed me. I think there's probably like I did have some friends, but I think there's probably some awkwardness around like eating lunch and socializing and where do I sit, that it was much easier to be seen as this like virtuous human sitting with the outsiders um,
Right.
than to be the awkward person in the cafeteria, not knowing where to sit and being overloaded. So it was really interesting looking back on my history. I did a lot of like seeking out the outcasts as a kind of virtuous human to feel good about myself when really it's like those were my people. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I wanted to come in as this like virtuous um person who was doing something kind to them, which is gross thinking back. But it's a really interesting adaptation to my social difficulties in high school.
Yeah. I'm thinking about that because it's interesting to think about in general the adaptation and seeking out the quote unquote outcasts or those who are struggling socially too. And I think throughout my life, and my friends would say this now, and college friends especially would make fun of me for it, but that I was always doing that, like finding the people who were clearly struggling and
Mhm.
connect with them. That even goes for like homeless folks when I was in college. Like my friends would be like, Patrick was always talking to these homeless people who were
Yeah,
like
same,
wandering
same.
the streets in upstate
Yep.
New York. It's like, yeah, I just kind of get you. I think you are intuitively drawn to those who are suffering. Um, because there's that communal suffering without having to name it. And I
Yep.
think that also plays a role socializing as a teenager when you're also struggling and hormones are raging and like all these social norms are starting to become your reality, but you don't know how to conform or adapt or fit in. And thank fucking God, and I'm not a religious person, that I had soccer because it was the only saving grace for me where it was like I played soccer in all throughout my life from 5 years old till now, and,
Mhm.
um, you know, in junior high, playing junior varsity, then in high school playing varsity, and, like, that was just the thing, and there was the routine, and there was the structure, and it was the
Mhm.
socializing, having to actually talk or communicate, and, um, that intensity seeking too of, like, "Oh,
Mhm.
man, go out and just run hard for 90 minutes and be competitive," and, like, that was wonderful, but, like, there were so many destructive behaviors going on too, like feeling so isolated and depressed and disconnected and unsure of who I was and like but the masking component is like the straight A's and the soccer team and like all this stuff. But in reality, what's happening behind the scenes is like lots of drug use and experimentation, lots of drinking, hanging out with the wrong people, getting into lots of trouble. And if not for my privilege, I probably should have ended up in jail multiple
Mm,
times for things that we did as teenagers. And just the realization of like, there was so much unhealthy coping behavior behind the scenes to deal with the inability to feel connected to anything or anchored to anything or any sense of what was going on. I couldn't sit still. You and I talked about this the other day of like that inability to feel that relief within your body where you have to be doing something all the fucking time and how
mm,
torturous that is. And I can remember calling friends at like a Tuesday at 5 or 6 o'clock, and I'd be like, "What are you doing?"
mhm,
Tuesday, like, I'm not doing anything. I'm like, "Can I come over? Like, can I get out of my house? Can I get
mhm,
out of can I be in movement to, like, do something else?" And that was very, very challenging.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. How old were you when the, like, experimenting with drug and alcohol started?
I was young. I mean, probably we're talking, like, 14-ish, 13,
Oh,
14,
young. Yeah, yeah.
because I had a good friend who had older brothers and older sisters and spent
Well,
a
and
lot
you
of
were unmedicated ADHD, which we know, like,
Yep.
so increases the risks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And, that was a way for a lot of people, not just autistic folks, but like it was just socializing and connection. It was like
Yeah,
we
yeah.
can go do this thing that we shouldn't be doing and it'll make us feel okay for the moment and feel connected. And
Mhm.
that it just gets so unhealthy and so quickly. It gets so destructive too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And it makes so much sense because, yeah, for all the reasons you mentioned, the social connection reduces the strain around that, and yeah, yeah.
And I think like those were rough years and it sounds like they were really challenging for you as well. And then when you move into like early adulthood, going into college, equally as challenging, if not more so, I think for myself. I don't know about for you, but I know like ages 17 till 21, 22 were really fucking hard too.
I I think I had a slightly different experience. They definitely had its moments, but for me, high school was so hard. Um, that when I got to college, that's like my mom used to say, like, you blossomed when you got to college. I think I had more learning difficulties than you did. So and it was never diagnosed, but yeah, school was just hard for me. But when I got to college and I got to study the things I was passionate about, um, that just like really changed me. And when I got into an academic culture, for me, um, academic culture has been where I get to camouflage because I can talk at a really like cognitive level and it's not weird. You don't have to do as much small talk in academic culture. So I think some of my quirks just got interpreted as being academic, and I went to some pretty like academic institutions. So for me, college, and then I went straight from college to seminary. So I did 7 years of school. I think I also like school because it gives me structure. Like I've done 10 years of graduate school. I'm and I just signed up to I just applied for institute, analytic institute. So I'm always in school because I think the structure and it gives me a place where I don't feel as outcast. I feel outcast when I'm like in any kind of conversation outside of academia, essentially.
Right. So school for you was actually really comforting in a lot of ways.
Once I got to higher ed, in high school and below, I really it's so interesting. I really thought I wasn't smart. And then I realized once I could study in my areas of special interest, I can be pretty like it's so interesting. I'm having a hard time saying I'm smart. I think I am smart. I think I am good with ideas and writing, but it's so hard for me to say that because but for college it was a struggle.
Yeah. It was just so hard in every sense of the word, it sounds like.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's hard to embrace that you are very intelligent, that you have a lot of great ideas, that you put a lot of great ideas out to the world. I imagine that gotta be conflicting at times when you go back to like younger you.
The workbook I'm working on for this month right now is on core schemas, which is essentially when we're young, we create these maps of who we are and who others are. And it's so hard when we interact with information that doesn't align with our core schema. There's this idea from social psychology called self-verification theory. So when we're given feedback that doesn't align with our belief of self, we tend to reject it. So even you just saying that, like, it's hard to accept that you are smart. Like, I started to fog out a little bit of like, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. I'm going to reject Patrick's words. Um, I think this happens so much for autistic people. Our core schemas tend to be very shame-based because of early life experiences. So then positive feedback can make us feel, A, we can reject it, but B, it can make us feel bad because it doesn't align with our core self.
Thanks for naming that. And we could do an episode on that for sure. Um, just core schemas and core beliefs of who we are and who we believe we are and what we believe in our capabilities as well. I have a really hard time taking positive feedback as well, and it just always hits me the wrong way where I'm like, it
Yeah.
grosses me out. Most I'm like,
Yeah.
frame this at
the-
that.
I just had that reaction and now I'm noticing I had that reaction. And then I went to an academic concept, which is how I regulate, right? Like, you said something nice about me. I started to get a little dysregulated because I was like, that doesn't feel good. And I'm like on camera. And so I went to my safe place, which is, let's talk about social psychology and core schemas.
I love that we're noticing this in the moment for everyone watching and listening, because these are coping skills. This is how people can circle back and anchor and ground again when you start to feel yourself drifting away.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And knowing
I
what those things are that ground us is so helpful.
so helpful. I mean, because there's a laundry list of ways to ground and you can look through 99% of them, and if they don't resonate or they don't feel comfortable to do, you're going to reject them.
Mhm,
And it can feel like nothing works. So I
mhm,
implore all of you to really seek out what feels safe, what feels secure, what feels anchored, what feels regulating for yourselves, because it's going to be different for everybody listening. Um, Megan has mentioned many times escaping to academia or that cognitive intellectual place and feeling safe. For me, it's a bit different, and I think we all need to find those places where you can go because of how often we can get dysregulated as well.
Yeah, when you're, so I know Game of Thrones is a place you go for regulation, but when you're in a conversation like this, you can't just like pull up Game of Thrones on your phone. Where do you go to ground?
So a lot of you can't see this, but right now I have like four sensory toys that I'm playing with
Uh-huh.
simultaneously. Like, this is you really can't see this, but this is like a stress
Ooh,
turbo,
that looks
and it has
amazing.
textures. My wife got it for me for Valentine's Day, and I've been messing with that the entire time we've been talking. So that's quite helpful. And I think sensory soothing for me is really helpful to help me get back in my body. So like these shell balls I really like because of the
I
textures of
love those. I have those. I love those. They're my favorite.
they make me so sad when you've like overused them and they're
And
like
they
no longer squishy.
put them
I
in the
have this,
fridge.
put them in the
Have
fridge.
it. Yeah,
This thing's full of sand, so this also helps. It's kind of like a
that looks
stretchy.
amazing. Oh my
So
gosh.
those are all really helpful for me. I think that, as for a lot of autistic people really feeling just uncomfortable in their bodies or disconnected from their bodies or whatever the case may be, I think that's why I've always sought out intensity in terms of sports and competition. It's the only time I can feel that. So that is a place that I'll go to. Um, but yeah, in conversations like this, it's always got to be like something tactile, because otherwise I will just disassociate, and then I won't be paying attention to you anymore and staring out the window over here. So
Yeah. Yeah. People listening can't see this, but like I've been rocking pretty much the whole time we've been talking, which is really soothing for me. I've also been listening to a song in one earbud this whole time on repeat. I actually learned this trick from Thomas Henley, who I did a podcast with a little bit ago. He mentioned, I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. I can reach out and ask. But he mentioned that when he publicly speaks, he puts music in his ears. And I was like, that's brilliant. So I've been doing it anytime I speak or like when we're on a podcast, and it really helps me.
That's amazing. I did not notice that. I noticed the rocking, but like obviously I don't notice that you're listening to music and
Right. It just
it's
looks like I'm listening to you.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's a
So
song.
important to be able to figure out those ways to have that bilateral stimulation too, and just to be able to soothe and this chair swivels, that helps a lot. If
Mhm.
I'm speaking, I'll be moving all the time. So even when I'm speaking at conferences, I'll say it right away, like I'm going to move nonstop while I'm on the stage. And I think I hope that it offers people comfort to do the same. Uh,
Mhm.
I have a colleague who recently did a webinar training where they were specifically instructed, like, you cannot move while you're on this camera. Like, you can't draw, you can't stim, you can't do this, you can't do this. And I was like, what the fuck?
I would
Wrong.
never do that webinar if I was in.
Right. Ableist as
Mhm.
hell.
It's
Two,
terrible.
I wouldn't be able to sit
No, no,
still.
I wouldn't either. Yeah.
And I think that's why I got
Terrible.
trouble so much as a kid, was just like
Mhm.
I could not sit still. Like I can get straight A's all fucking day without having to pay
I'm gonna
attention
be
to my
moving while I do it.
I'm gonna be moving and I'm not gonna be looking at you. And
Yeah.
teachers and professors who are not ND savvy are just gonna be like, you're disrupting the class. Like you're ruining the class
Mhm.
atmosphere. That was definitely on a lot of report cards. So
I'm sure
straight
it
A is really smart, really intelligent, disrupts the class,
was.
behavioral. Like it's just, both had to be true, I guess. But
And this is why assessors ask for report cards when you do an assessment. They want those notes are gold.
yeah. And just having that collateral information is so helpful to kind of get a sense of, because you
Mhm.
can myself, Megan, and my memories are quite different about childhood. Like it would be very hard for me to accurately
Yeah.
give information in any sort of testimonial about like what was childhood like, what you remember doing and not doing, and it just wouldn't come to me. So that collateral information is really helpful to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Patrick, it is time for our awkward goodbye because I've got clients to get to. Um, I'm not even gonna try and like smoothly transition us. I'm just gonna like
I like the abrupt recommendation. So thanks for everyone listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast on all major platforms. Like, download, subscribe, and share. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.